90 days from today, one of two people will exist. Which one depends entirely on what happens in the next 24 hours and almost nothing else. The first version of you looks nearly identical to who you are right now. Same habits, same excuses, same vague sense that things will improve eventually, once conditions align. The second version has done one specific thing every single day for 90 days, without exception, without waiting for motivation, without needing the conditions to be perfect. And I want to tell you plainly, before this video goes any further, that the second version is not a different person with different willpower. The second version is you, having simply refused to stop on the days it felt pointless. Napoleon Hill studied hundreds of men who built extraordinary results from ordinary starting positions, and he found almost no correlation between their initial talent and their eventual outcome. What he found instead was a single, repeatable pattern, a decision made once, defended daily, for a defined stretch of time long enough for the decision to become irreversible. 90 days is that stretch. Not because of anything mystical about the number, but because of what actually happens to the human brain and the human identity across that specific span of time, which I am going to explain to you in exact mechanical terms over the next 40 minutes. By the end of this video, you will know precisely what to expect in each phase of those 90 days, why most people quit at an identifiable, predictable point, and exactly what tools prevent that from happening to you. The myth of the leap. Somewhere in modern culture, a specific and damaging idea took root, that meaningful change happens through a single dramatic moment, a decision made at rock bottom, a sudden burst of inspiration, a turning point vivid enough to serve as its own motivation for years afterward. This idea is almost entirely false, and believing it is one of the most reliable ways to guarantee that change never actually happens. Hill's own research told a different story. The men he studied did not describe a single transformative moment as the mechanism of their success. They described, almost without exception, a period of sustained, often unremarkable daily action that produced no dramatic feeling at all in the moment it was happening. The drama, when it existed, showed up only in hindsight, once the results had accumulated to a point where they became visible to others. In the actual living of it, day to day, the process felt closer to routine than to inspiration. This matters because it explains why so many people, waiting for the big moment before they begin, never begin at all. If change requires a feeling of readiness intense enough to carry a person through months of effort, and that feeling rarely arrives, or arrives and then fades within days, the entire mechanism for change has been built on a foundation that was never reliable to begin with. Motivation, as a felt state, is notoriously short-lived. It spikes at the start of any new commitment and then declines steadily, regardless of how genuine the initial conviction was. A plan built entirely on sustained motivation is a plan built to fail by roughly the second week, and this is precisely why so many familiar patterns, the January resolution abandoned by February, the diet abandoned within a month, the new habit abandoned the first time life gets busy, follow an almost identical timeline across nearly everyone who's ever attempted them. The corrective is not to wait for a bigger feeling, it is to remove the requirement for feeling anything at all, replacing it with a structure so small and so specific that showing up does not depend on how you feel that day. This is the actual mechanism behind every sustained 90-day transformation Hill documented, and it is the mechanism this entire video is going to build for you, piece by piece, starting now. The one definite aim. Before a single day of the 90 can begin, one decision has to be made, and it has to be made with far more specificity than most people bring to it. Hill's principle of a definite chief aim is not simply want something. It is a single, precisely stated target, narrow enough that on any given day there is no ambiguity about whether it was accomplished or not. Here is the test that separates a real 90-day aim from a vague intention dressed up as one. Could a stranger, looking only at your actions on any single day, determine with certainty whether you did the thing or didn't? I want to get healthier fails this test completely. It's too broad to be checked against a single day's actions. I will walk for 20 minutes passes the test instantly. Either it happened today or it didn't, with no room for interpretation. This specificity matters enormously more than it might initially seem to, because ambiguous goals create a specific failure mode. They allow the mind to quietly redefine success downward on hard days, counting something as sufficient that wouldn't have counted on an easier day. And this quiet redefinition, repeated often enough, erodes the entire structure without ever producing a single moment that feels like an outright failure. A specific binary aim closes this loophole entirely. There is no redefining, did I walk for 20 minutes today? The answer is factual, not negotiable. Choose your 90-day aim now before continuing using this test. It can be almost anything: a skill practiced daily, a physical habit, a piece of specialized knowledge built through daily study, a creative work advanced by a fixed daily unit, a relationship deliberately nurtured through a specific daily action. The category matters far less than the specificity. Write it down in a single sentence, phrased so that its completion or non-completion on any given day is entirely unambiguous. This single sentence is the anchor for everything that follows in the next 40 minutes, and everything from this point forward assumes it has been written. Why 90, not 21? A widely repeated figure claims that a new habit forms in 21 days. This figure is not supported by the research it's usually attributed to, and believing it sets an expectation that actively works against the person trying to build a lasting change, because it promises an ease and a speed that the actual mechanics of habit formation do not deliver. Here is what's actually documented in more careful and more recent research into how habits form. The time required for a new behavior to become automatic, meaning it requires meaningfully less conscious effort and willpower to perform than it did on day one, varies considerably depending on the complexity of the behavior and the person performing it, but consistently lands in a range considerably longer than 21 days for the great majority of people and behaviors, frequently landing closer to 2 to 3 months of consistent repetition before the behavior begins to feel genuinely automatic rather than effortful. This is precisely why 90 days functions as a meaningful unit, distinct from the shorter and more popular figure. It is long enough to reach the point where a behavior has genuinely begun shifting from effortful to automatic for most people and most reasonably complex behaviors, and it is short enough to remain a bounded, comprehensible unit of time rather than an open-ended, indefinite commitment that's harder to hold in mind and easier to abandon somewhere in the vague middle. There's a second reason 90 days matters, distinct from the purely neurological one, and it concerns the visible evidence a person accumulates about themselves across that span. 21 days rarely produces enough accumulated repetition for a person to have generated substantial proof of their own consistency. A few weeks of a new behavior is easily dismissed, even by the person performing it, as not yet meaningful. 90 days, by contrast, produces roughly 3 times the repetitions, and at that volume, the accumulated evidence becomes considerably harder to dismiss, even by a mind actively inclined towards self-doubt. This accumulated evidence becomes its own form of proof, referenced directly later in this video, and it is simply unavailable at the shorter, more popular time frame. Understand this going in. The 90 days are not an arbitrary challenge length chosen for marketing convenience. They correspond to the actual, documented span of time required for the specific neurological and psychological shift this entire process depends on. And shortening that span doesn't make the shift happen faster, it simply stops the process before the shift has actually occurred. Days 1 to 10, the novelty phase. Understanding what to expect in each phase of the 90 days is itself one of the most powerful tools available for surviving the phase, because unexpected difficulty derails people far more reliably than anticipated difficulty does. So let's walk through exactly what each stretch of these 90 days typically feels like, starting with the beginning. The first 10 days or so are typically characterized by what can be called the novelty phase. The new behavior carries a certain freshness, a sense of embarking on something, and this freshness produces a felt motivation that makes the early days considerably easier than the days that follow. This is precisely the trap embedded in the myth of the leap addressed earlier. The early days feel so manageable, riding on genuine initial enthusiasm, that a person can easily conclude the entire 90 days will feel this way and build no contingency for what happens once the novelty fades, which it reliably does. This phase is also where a specific and important mechanism begins operating below conscious awareness, the earliest neurological groundwork for the eventual automaticity described in the previous section. Each repetition during this phase, however easy it currently feels, is contributing to that eventual shift, even though the shift itself won't become noticeable for a considerably longer stretch. This is worth naming explicitly, because the ease of this phase can create a false impression that the entire process is easier than it actually is, an impression that then collides painfully with the phase that follows. The practical instruction for these first 10 days is simple. Perform the action exactly as specified in your single-sentence definite aim every day, without expanding it, without adding to it out of excess early enthusiasm. A common mistake in this phase is overcommitting based on how manageable the behavior currently feels, only to find the expanded version considerably harder to sustain once the novelty fades. Keep the action exactly as originally defined. The novelty phase is not the time to test how much further you can push. It is the time to establish the baseline rhythm that the remaining 80 days will depend on. Days 11 to 30, the resistance phase. Somewhere around the second week, for the overwhelming majority of people attempting any sustained new behavior, the novelty that carried the first phase begins to fade, and what replaces it is what can be called the resistance phase, a stretch typically running from roughly day 11 through day 30, where the behavior no longer carries any inherent freshness, has not yet become automatic, and requires the largest sustained amount of conscious willpower of any point across the entire 90 days. This is the single most predictable point of abandonment across nearly every documented account of habit formation, and I want to be extremely direct about why, because understanding the mechanism is what allows you to recognize it as a phase rather than as evidence that the entire attempt has failed. During this phase, the behavior has lost the emotional lift of novelty, but has not yet gained the structural support of automaticity. It is, for this specific stretch, at its most effortful point across the entire 90-day span, requiring genuine conscious willpower on every single occurrence, with none of the ease that either the beginning or the later stages will eventually provide. Willpower, as established repeatedly across behavioral research, is a genuinely limited resource within any given day, and a behavior that requires substantial conscious willpower every single day for an extended stretch is, by definition, vulnerable to any day where willpower is unusually depleted by other demands, a stressful event, a poor night's sleep, an unusually demanding day at work. This is precisely why the resistance phase produces the highest rate of abandonment of any stretch across the 90 days. It is the phase most dependent on a resource that fluctuates unpredictably and is frequently in short supply. The critical piece of information to carry into this phase, before it arrives, is this. The difficulty experienced during days 11 through 30 is not a sign that the behavior is wrong for you, that you lack the discipline others apparently have, or that the entire attempt was a mistake. It is the expected, well-documented shape of habit formation, arriving on schedule, exactly as it arrives for everyone who has ever successfully built a sustained new behavior. The difference between the people who make it through this phase and the people who don't is rarely a difference in the intensity of the difficulty experienced. It is a difference in whether the difficulty was anticipated and prepared for, or encountered as an unexpected sign of failure. The minimum viable action. Here is the single most important practical tool for surviving the resistance phase just described, and it directly addresses the specific vulnerability created by depending on a fluctuating resource like daily willpower. Define, in advance, a minimum viable version of your 90-day action, a version so small, so undeniably easy, that it can be completed even on the worst possible day, even when willpower is at its lowest point, even when every circumstance is working against you. If your defined aim is 20 minutes of a given activity, the minimum viable version might be 2 minutes. If your aim is a full session of focused practice, the minimum viable version might be opening the materials and doing a single repetition. The specific size of the minimum matters less than one non-negotiable property. It must be small enough that there is no legitimate excuse for skipping it entirely, on any day, under any circumstance short of genuine incapacity. The purpose of this minimum is not to replace the full version of the action on most days. On the great majority of days, across most of the 90, you will do the full version as originally defined. The minimum exists specifically for the handful of days, and there will be a handful where the full version genuinely cannot be sustained, where circumstances or depleted willpower make the complete action feel impossible. On those specific days, the minimum viable version is performed instead, preserving something more valuable than the specific quantity of the action, the unbroken continuity of the chain. This distinction matters more than it might initially appear to, and it connects directly to the tracking mechanism described later in this video. A day where the minimum was completed instead of the full version is still, factually, a day where the behavior occurred. The chain remains unbroken, the identity being built through repetition remains intact, and the psychological cost of starting over, which we'll address directly in a later section, never gets triggered. A day where nothing at all was done, by contrast, breaks the chain entirely and introduces the exact vulnerability that causes so many 90-day attempts to collapse during the resistance phase specifically, since that phase is precisely when willpower is least reliable and a fallback option is most needed. Define your minimum viable action right now, in writing, alongside your original definite aim. It should feel almost embarrassingly small. That's not a flaw in the exercise, that's the entire point of it. Days 31 to 60, the identity shift. Somewhere around day 30, for most people who have survived the resistance phase intact, something begins to change that is different in kind from anything experienced in the first 30 days. The action, still requiring conscious effort, begins to require noticeably less of it than it did during the resistance phase, and something else, less mechanical and more significant, begins to emerge alongside that reduced effort. The behavior starts to feel less like something you are doing and more like something you simply are. This is the identity shift, and it is worth understanding precisely because it represents the actual mechanism behind long-term, self-sustaining behavior change, distinct from the willpower-dependent mechanism that carried the first 30 days. Once a behavior becomes sufficiently associated with your own self-concept, once "I do this thing daily" shifts from a description of a temporary project to a description of who you understand yourself to be, the behavior no longer requires the same category of willpower to sustain because maintaining it is no longer experienced as effort applied against resistance. It is experienced as simply acting consistently with an already established identity, which requires dramatically less conscious exertion than acting against an identity that hasn't yet caught up to the new behavior. This shift does not arrive suddenly or announce itself clearly. It tends to be noticed only in retrospect, often when a day is missed unexpectedly, and produces a felt sense of genuine discomfort. Not guilt exactly, but something closer to a mismatch, a sense that the missed day doesn't fit who you've become. That specific felt discomfort, when it first appears, is reliable evidence that the identity shift has genuinely occurred, because it could not be produced by a behavior still being sustained purely through effortful willpower, which produces relief rather than discomfort when a day is skipped. Days 31 through 60 are where this shift typically consolidates, provided the resistance phase was survived using the tools already described. The practical instruction across this stretch is less about pushing through difficulty, which has genuinely begun to lessen by this point, and more about protecting the emerging identity from being undermined by complacency. The specific risk that, because the behavior finally feels easier, its importance gets quietly downgraded in your own mind, treated as optional now that it no longer requires visible struggle. Continue treating the action with the same seriousness it received during the harder early phase, even as it becomes easier to perform, because the identity being built during this stretch is still, at this point, considerably less durable than it will become by day 90. Auto-suggestion for the 90 days. Hill placed significant weight on auto-suggestion, the deliberate, repeated impression of a specific idea upon the subconscious mind, as a tool for accelerating exactly the kind of identity shift described in the previous section, and it applies with particular precision to a defined 90-day undertaking, because the fixed endpoint gives the practice a clear target to organize around. Here is the specific version of this practice built for the 90 days. Each morning, before beginning the day's version of your defined action, state a single sentence, out loud if circumstances allow, silently if they don't. A present tense statement naming the specific identity being built, tied to the actual action defined at the start of this process. Not, "I will become consistent," which places the outcome in an undefined future. Instead, something closer to, "I am someone who does this, every day, regardless of how I feel about it this morning." The statement should reference the actual specific action, not a vague aspiration, for the same reason the definite aim itself needed to be specific rather than vague. The mechanism behind this practice is not mystical, and it doesn't need to be treated as such to take it seriously. Repeated, deliberate self-statement, particularly when performed at the specific moment just before an action is undertaken, functions as a form of mental rehearsal, priming the specific behavior about to be performed and reinforcing the identity connection described in the previous section. This is structurally similar to practices used deliberately across many disciplines that depend on consistent performance under varying conditions. The statement is not decoration around the action. It is a functional part of what makes the action easier to sustain across 90 consecutive days. Perform this practice every single day across all 90, regardless of which phase you're currently in. It costs seconds and requires no equipment, no special conditions, nothing beyond a moment of genuine attention paid to a single sentence before the day's action begins. Its value compounds precisely the way the underlying habit itself compounds, negligible in any single instance, meaningfully reinforcing across the full 90-day span. The visible chain. Everything described so far depends on one additional mechanism to function reliably across a full 90 days, a visible, physical record of the streak itself, checked and updated daily, in a location you cannot avoid seeing. This can take a simple physical form, a calendar with a mark placed on it each day the action was completed, whether the full version or the minimum viable version described earlier, or a digital equivalent, provided it produces the same essential property, an accumulating, visible chain of completed days that grows longer with each repetition, and that you actually look at regularly, not simply update in the background without attention. The reason this visible record matters as much as it does connects directly to the identity shift described earlier. A long, visible, unbroken chain becomes its own form of evidence, distinct from and more powerful than the internal feeling of progress, which fluctuates day to day and is notoriously unreliable as a gauge of actual accumulated consistency. On a difficult day when internal motivation is low and the resistance phase's characteristic difficulty is fully present, a long, visible chain provides an external, undeniable reason to continue that does not depend on how the day happens to feel. The specific, concrete reluctance to be the one who broke a chain that has grown to a genuinely significant length. This mechanism, sometimes described informally as "don't break the chain," has been used deliberately by a wide range of people across a wide range of disciplines, specifically because it produces measurable behavioral effects distinct from willpower alone. The visible length of the chain itself becomes a form of accumulated stake in the outcome, and this stake grows heavier in a psychologically meaningful sense with every single day added to it, which is precisely why the resistance phase, arriving early while the chain is still short, is considerably more dangerous than an equivalent difficult day arriving later, once the visible chain has grown long enough to carry its own protective weight. Set up this tracking mechanism today, before the first day begins, in a location you will genuinely encounter daily rather than one requiring deliberate effort to check. Mark it the same moment the day's action is completed, not later, not from memory. The immediate marking reinforces the connection between the action and its record in a way that delayed marking does not. Days 61 to 90, the compounding phase. By day 60, for anyone who has maintained the structure described across the preceding stretches, something distinct begins to characterize the final third of the 90 days. Not simply continued consistency, but a specific kind of compounding across multiple dimensions simultaneously, each reinforcing the others in ways that weren't yet available during the earlier phases. Skill compounds first, and most visibly, if your defined action involves any element of practiced ability. 60 days of repetition produces a noticeably different level of competence than the first 10 or even 30 days did, and this improving competence itself becomes a source of genuine, felt motivation distinct from the manufactured motivation of autosuggestion, because it's now grounded in real, observable progress rather than pure discipline alone. Self-trust compounds second, and this dimension matters considerably more than it initially appears to, because it extends far beyond the specific 90-day action itself. Each completed day, across 60 days of evidence, becomes part of an accumulating internal case for a specific proposition, that you are, in fact, someone who follows through on stated commitments, even when those commitments become difficult, even when motivation genuinely fades. This proposition, once sufficiently evidenced, begins quietly affecting decisions entirely unrelated to the original 90-day action, because self-trust, once genuinely established in one domain, tends to generalize into a broader willingness to commit to difficult things elsewhere, precisely because the internal evidence no longer supports the older assumption that commitments made under difficulty tend to be abandoned. Ease compounds third, in the specific mechanical sense already described through the identity shift. By day 60, and increasingly through day 90, the action requires a genuinely smaller expenditure of conscious willpower than it did even during the identity shift stretch of days 31 through 60, continuing the trajectory established once the resistance phase was survived. The practical instruction for this final stretch is, in one sense, the simplest of the entire 90 days: continue exactly what has already been established, without introducing significant changes to the core action during this period. This is not the time to dramatically expand the behavior or add new elements, tempting as that might feel given the increasing ease. The final 30 days exist to consolidate what has already been built, extending the visible chain to its full length and allowing the compounding described above to fully develop, rather than diluting that consolidation by introducing new variables this late in the process. The miss-a-day protocol. Despite every tool described so far, a day will occasionally be missed entirely, not the minimum viable version but genuinely nothing, due to circumstances that overwhelmed even the smallest fallback option. This will happen to a meaningful percentage of people attempting a genuine 90-day undertaking, and how that single missed day is handled in the moment immediately following it determines, more than almost any other single factor, whether the entire 90-day attempt survives or quietly collapses. Here is the specific, correct response, stated plainly because the incorrect response is so much more common and so much more damaging. The incorrect response treats a single missed day as evidence that the entire attempt has failed, that the chain is now meaningless, that starting over from day one is somehow required to make the effort count. This response is not supported by anything in the actual mechanics described across this entire video. A single missed day does not erase 60 days of accumulated identity shift, does not reset the neurological groundwork built through the preceding repetitions, and does not require restarting the count from zero to remain valid. The correct response is simpler and considerably more forgiving. The very next day, without exception, the action resumes, exactly as originally defined, with no attempt to make up the missed day through some doubled or extended version, and critically, without treating the missed day as requiring a fresh restart of the entire count. One missed day, followed immediately by resumed consistency, produces a 90-day span with a single gap in it, not a failed attempt requiring restart, but a slightly imperfect version of the exact same underlying process, still producing the great majority of the same benefits described throughout this video. The actual danger was never a single missed day. The actual danger is the specific psychological pattern that treats a single missed day as license for a second missed day, and then a third, because the streak is already broken anyway, a pattern that converts one recoverable lapse into a genuine collapse of the entire effort. Name this pattern the moment a day is missed, and resume immediately, exactly as described, refusing the invitation to let one gap become permission for several more. What actually changes at day 90? Let's name, concretely, what tends to be genuinely different by day 90 for someone who has followed this structure, because vague talk of transformation means little without specific, honest description of what actually changes and what doesn't. The specific skill or behavior defined at the outset will, in nearly every case, have shifted from effortful to substantially automatic, requiring a fraction of the conscious willpower it required on day one, and frequently accompanied by measurable improvement in whatever capacity the action was building. The internal identity will have shifted alongside it, from someone attempting this to someone who does this, a shift that, once genuinely established, tends to persist well beyond the 90-day window itself, rather than requiring the same effortful maintenance indefinitely. The accumulated self-trust described earlier will have extended, in most cases, into a broader willingness to commit to other difficult undertakings, because the internal evidence base regarding your own follow-through has been genuinely, factually strengthened, not simply asserted through affirmation. What will not have changed? and this deserves honest statement rather than being glossed over, is everything the 90 days never addressed. A single 90-day undertaking does not resolve every difficulty in a person's life, does not produce complete mastery of a complex skill, and does not eliminate the need for continued effort beyond day 90 in whatever direction the undertaking was pointed. What it produces, reliably, is proof. Proof that the mechanism described across this entire video actually functions. Proof that can then be applied deliberately to a second 90-day undertaking, and a third, each one building on the self-trust and structural understanding established by the ones before it. This is, in the end, the actual answer to the question posed in this video's title. What could happen across 90 days of genuine consistency is not a single dramatic transformation arriving all at once on the morning of day 91. It is the quiet, well-documented, entirely mechanical process of a difficult thing becoming an easy thing, and an attempted identity becoming an actual one. A process available to anyone willing to begin today, with a single, specific, small enough action, and to keep marking the chain, day after day, through the phase that feels like nothing is happening, until it becomes unmistakably clear that something was happening the entire time. You now understand what the next 90 days actually require. Not constant motivation, which was never a reliable foundation to begin with, but a specific, small, clearly defined action, a minimum viable fallback for the days willpower runs short, a visible record that grows daily, and a plan for the single day, somewhere in the middle, that will inevitably get missed. Hill's own research, across hundreds of individual case studies, did not find that extraordinary outcomes required extraordinary starting talent. It found a single repeatable mechanism defended daily for long enough that the defending eventually stopped requiring effort at all. Write your definite aim in one sentence right now. Write its minimum viable version beneath it. Set up the visible chain before you sleep tonight. Day 1 begins tomorrow morning, with the single sentence stated before the first action, exactly as described. 90 days from today, one of two people will exist. Decide, tonight, which one. Go and do it.